going to go ahead and get started just so we can keep with our time frame. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ariel Ilaya, and I am one of the co-founders of Fashion Studies Alliance. I'm so excited to welcome you to one of our other editions of Getting to Know, an online series where we chat with our fashion studies community from around the world about their career trajectory and current research. Toward the end, we will be opening it up for questions. And this week, we are joined by Amy Padnani, an editor on the Obituaries desk at the New York Times and creator of Overlooked, an award-winning project that tells the stories of remarkable women and people of color whose deaths were not reported by the newspaper. The column has also inspired a TV series on Netflix. Before joining the Times, Amy, a native New Yorker, worked as a reporter at the Star-Ledger, the Journal News, Newsday, the Staten Island Advance, and the Herald News. Amy is passionate about diversity and serves as a co-chair of the Asian Network, an employee group. She is also a pool player, a marathon runner, and is co-captain of the Times Running Club. In 2018, she was named Incredible Woman of the Year by Porter Magazine. Amy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me.
So to get started, can you tell us a little bit about your educational background and your training as a journalist?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a native New Yorker. I was born in Queens, and I just always knew I wanted to be a journalist. When I was 14, I volunteered for my hometown weekly, the Queens Gazette. And I also worked on the high school paper at Bronx Science. I was a photo editor and also a reporter. And I continued with that when I went to college at NYU. I worked with the newspaper there. And I had many internships. You mentioned some of the places where I worked. And print journalism was always my passion. I think it started when I was little, and I loved the show, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And there was this character, April, who wore the yellow jumpsuit. She was a reporter, and I don't know, I loved the show. I used to pretend I was her and write these news stories, pretend news stories I would read to my dad every day. I loved writing and storytelling. It was just something that was really important to me. And the more I got involved in journalism, the more I realized how important this sort of storytelling could be to bring new light to new voices and really give people representation. So I joined the New York Times in 2011, and I've been on the Obituaries desk for about 3.5 years now. It was 2017 that I joined Obits.
Amazing. And is there a particular part of your career that has had a significant impact?
Yeah, so my background is in reporting. It was interesting for me switching over to editing. For a while, I was in the digital sphere, and when I joined Obits, it was originally as a digital editor. So it's a very traditional, backward-looking, print-focused section. But I was charged with really trying to find new ways of storytelling. It's interesting to me because I was charged with visual storytelling, but I also started becoming passionate about diversity at this time. And so that was when I started realizing that there was more we could be doing for diversity with our obituaries. I'm going to share with you a little presentation of a few slides to describe the project I ended up creating as all of this was going on in my mind. Okay, so when I joined Obits in early 2017, I noticed that we would get these notes from readers sometimes saying, why don't you have more women and people of color in your obituaries? And I wondered the same. It wasn't really in my wheelhouse to consider this as a visual storyteller, but I just really wanted to know more about, what do we say to these readers every time they write to us? And since I was new to the team, I asked my coworkers, what is a typical response? And they said, well, the people who are dying today are from a generation when women and people of color were not invited to the table to make a difference. So, it's going to take some time, maybe in a generation or two, that's when we'll see more women in our obituaries. But that answer just was not satisfying to me at all. I wanted to know, where are all the dead women? And so around this time, as I said, I was getting involved in diversity. I took a leadership course with the Asian American Journalists Association, and they sent me home with this sort of saying that stuck with me. Leadership is a behavior, not a role. So it doesn't matter if you're an underling or you're a manager, no matter where you are in your career, you can make a difference. And we also talked a lot about diversity and the importance of diversity in newsrooms. And so it just made me feel more empowered as somebody on this team with a fresh set of eyes. What could I be doing? And obituaries are an interesting art form for that way because each one focuses on an individual person. So all of this was sort of going on in the back of my mind when I came across a website talking about a woman named Mary Outerbridge. So she was credited with introducing tennis to America in 1874. And I thought, wow, that's really neat. Tennis was introduced to America by a woman. Does anyone know that? And did she get a New York Times obituary? Spoiler alert, she did not. And so I started wondering who else we missed. And there were some surprises. The pioneering journalist Ida B. Wells, who started the campaign against lynching, Sylvia Plath, the brilliant poet, and Ada Lovelace, who's now considered the first ever computer programmer. So I thought maybe now is a time to tell their stories. And I went back to my team and suggested that we do this project called Overlooked. And so Overlooked launched on March 8th, 2018 with the stories of 15 remarkable women. And we've been adding to the series ever since. We also got a ton of reader suggestions. I had no idea just how powerful this project would be and what the response would be. But so many people thought of really important women that they had known in their lives who were never recognized. One of them, my all-time favorite, is Grandma Gatewood. So she was the victim of domestic violence at the hands of her husband for about 30 years. She got into many violent incidents with him. And one, he hit her over the head with a broomstick and she threw flour in his face. And when the police came, they arrested her, not him. And so the mayor of the town saw her in jail and took her into his own home until she could get back on her feet. It was around this time she read an article in National Geographic about how no woman had ever hiked the Appalachian Trail in its entirety alone. And she said, you know what? I'm going to do it. And she did. She did it not just once, but 3 times and became the only person, man or woman, to accomplish the entire thing 3 times. And so it was just a really amazing story about fortitude and just reinventing who you are, even despite all of the challenges in the past. That's probably why it's my favorite. But I also loved this tale about Annie Edson Taylor. She was actually kind of a shyster. She was always trying to find money-making schemes. And at some point around the time of the World Fair, she learned that nobody had ever survived going over Niagara Falls in a barrel. Very random thing, but it was considered like kind of one of these highlights of these sorts of world fairs, these competitions and things. So she decided she would do it. She did a lot of research. She had a custom-made barrel with lots of air pockets in it. That was one of the main reasons people didn't survive, was the air pressure. And she did it. I mean, she was beat up and all, but she did it, and she hoped to make a career out of it. She wrote a book. She traveled the world talking about it, but she never quite got to where she wanted to be. But I just think it's such an interesting tale of this honest. It's like honest because she was kind of a shyster, but it's also just kind of quirky. And so some of the people I've learned about have just been really fascinating. I can tell you about a couple that you might be interested in going forward. Well, we had one for Earl Tucker. He was a dancer known as Snake Hips. And if you've ever seen him dance, it's really almost kind of creepy. How does he move like that? But it's pretty amazing. And a lot of his hip movements were mimicked by people like Elvis Presley down the line. So he had a really big impact on dance. And still to come, there's Anya Phillips. She is not very well known, but she was a big influencer in the East Village punk scene in the 70s and 80s. She dated James Chance, and she also she was into fashion. She dressed a lot of people for their covers, like Blondie, and just was really well known for her creativity, particularly with spandex and fishnet and things like that. There's also Jay Jackson, who you probably have heard about recently, in fact. He was a pioneering fashion designer. He came up during Black History Month when somebody mentioned that he never got an obit. And so he's still to come. There's also a special section of Overlooked we're doing for people with disabilities for the 30th anniversary of the passage of ADA. So I'm really looking forward to telling the story of Brad Lomax. He was a Black Panther who was very involved in the 504 sit-in in San Francisco. That sit-in was like really important because it was a precursor to the passage of ADA. This is the 30th anniversary, so we're looking back in that moment. Another person who came up for me was Cheryl Marie Wade. She was known as the Queen Mother of Gnarly. She had quite a sense of humor and was known to be kind of raunchy at times. She was a playwright and an actress who started a theater group of plays written by women for women. So I think that should give you a good flavor of Overlooked and all the sort of amazing people that it includes.
So wonderful, all those histories to now be highlighted again. So, when starting Overlooked, I'm sure you had to face some challenges. Can you speak a little bit about what those might be and how you overcame those?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm sure a lot of people know, institutional change and acceptance is just really hard. I mean, we're in another moment now with Black Lives Matters and lots of interesting conversations about race and representation in organizations. This was the case for me as well with Overlooked. It was tricky because, as I mentioned, I was working with a really traditionally minded desk, and they were very focused on telling the stories of people who died today. It was very awkward to be looking back into the past. But I basically found some advocates in the newsroom. There were many women who were really passionate about this project when they learned about it. There's one advocate in particular who is a high-ranking editor. As soon as I told her, I have this kind of thought for this project, she said, "Oh my gosh, I love that idea." And she really helped me shop it around with the higher ups. And the more people learned about it, the more excited they got, including my own team, who, kind of brought into their view a little bit more. And so that's really, it did take time. It took about a year probably to get it off the ground and to get that level of support. But I think having those sorts of conversations with as many people as you can is what's so key.
And that's so nice to hear too, because I think oftentimes too that you were fairly new at the obituary desk and trying to propose a new project that oftentimes it might fall flat on its face, but really trying to get those advocates to build up so you can actually create and launch that. So I'm sure you had said that a lot of people write in asking to have an obituary written or have somebody in Overlooked. How do you go about selecting the figures that will be highlighted in Overlooked?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. The New York Times has such a high bar for who gets an obituary. Often
Hmm.
it's a famous actress or actor or musician or scholar or inventor. We had the guy who invented the wetsuit, who was like a beach bum who just wanted to be able to surf year round. We had the inventor of the sock puppet. I mean, like just all kinds of interesting people who come up, but they have to have really made a mark on society and made some kind of change. And so I take that same sort of criteria in considering Overlooked. We were a little bit worried when we published the project that there would be a lot of people saying, "You never did an obituary on my grandma," and it would just be, an average person that maybe readers don't really gravitate toward, reading about. But in fact, we capitalized on that moment too and gave them a voice by doing kind of an article just about overlooked grandmas, which ended up being really sweet and well received. But for the most part, yeah, I think I take the same criteria for overlooked people who have made a difference or changed society in some way or changed the way of life for a group of people. The one exception is considering the fact that these people may not have gotten the degree of attention that they deserved, hence overlooked. And so some of these people were actually overlooked in their lifetime and didn't get that degree of fame. So I try to keep that in mind as I'm looking into who to consider.
Excellent. And as a journalist, I think in, both fashion history and probably a lot of the work that you do, research is such an important aspect to it. How do you go about researching it? How long is the process? And what do you do exactly in your research?
It can be really complicated writing about somebody who died more than 100 years ago. I know I ran into issues myself with Mary Outerbridge, the woman who brought tennis to America. You know, I had seen articles saying it was actually this other guy from Massachusetts who first set up a tennis court on his uncle's lawn. And I thought, oh no, was it not Mary? Was it this other guy whose name I can't remember? And so I read numerous articles in the New York Times looking back. This is after both people had died, but looking back to see, well, who was it? Who actually gets the credit? And the New York Times decided it was, in fact, Mary Outerbridge. They secured a passenger, like a list of the passengers on the ship she sailed on from Bermuda back to the States. She had been there on vacation and she watched some British Army officers playing and wondered what the game was, and they sent her home with a net and some rackets. And so it was determined, yes, it was Mary Outerbridge. I'm like, great. So then I called a tennis historian to interview for my story, and he says, wait a second. You're saying Mary Outerbridge brought tennis to America? And I said, well, yeah, it was decided in the pages of the New York Times itself. And he said, oh, no. There are at least 6 people credited with bringing tennis to America, and she's just one of them. So we went over why it was so complicated to know, and it was because that British Army officer had gotten a patent for a sort of box set, like he would sell it as a game, almost like Monopoly, and it just became really popular really fast. So it was hard to determine who was the first. So it was interesting to me to know that had happened, and it was definitely a good cautionary tale going forward. A colleague of mine named Nikita Stewart, she wrote and overlooked for Bessie Stringfield. She was known as the motorcycle queen of Miami. She would do all kinds of tricks on her motorcycle in the 1930s, going through the Jim Crow South. I mean, nobody would see a black lady on a motorcycle in those days. And people loved her. But as it turns out, Nikita calls me one day and she says, well, I'm reporting this story, but I ran into a problem. Bessie lied. Like, she lied about her parents. She lied about her ethnicity. She lied about where she was born and where she grew up. It's like all these little biographical details. Like, she was almost embarrassed about her past and her upbringing. And so she said, I don't know. Do we even write this story anymore? And I said, well, do you know the actual facts? And she said, yeah, I got the death certificate, the birth certificate, everything. I have the details. But when I talked to her best friend who's doing a biography on her, the best friend said, no, this is how Bessie wanted to be known. And so she was really angry at the facts being revealed. And so, of course, we print the facts. And I said, I think you have to write all of this into your story somehow. The fact that she lied about her past says so much about what she was up against. And it became a recurring theme, especially when we did a special section for Black History Month, that a lot of people make up facts about their past just to get ahead in life. So those are a couple of the instances. There's one story that, if you'll stick with me on, I still want to tell and have not been able to. It's also a little bit fashion themes. There was this woman I learned about named Sadie Williams, and in 1898, she was riding a streetcar in Chicago when these 2 guys jumped on board and started assaulting the conductor, and they were trying to rob the passengers. Nobody was doing anything, so she got out of her seat. She took her hat pin from her hat and stabbed the robbers, and they screamed and they ran off the trolley and ran away. And the conductor said, oh my gosh, this woman was braver than any man I know. They gave her a $10 check, for being so brave and saving this man's life, blah, 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 blah. I read all this stuff about these editorials that ran after about how she had sort of weaponized fashion. This was around the time when women started walking around unaccompanied by men, and they wanted to feel safe. And so they were getting assaulted everywhere, basically. I mean, we all know the story today too. So she, that day when she used her hat pin, they said, this is how women are being resourceful, and hat pins frequently began being used to stab men who were bugging women. And so the men who were in government got really annoyed with the women stabbing them all the time. And they said, well, from now on, we are banning hat pins of a certain length or requiring the tips to be covered. And women were so angry. They went out in droves. There were protests all around the world, not just in Chicago or in the US. Women all over the world were out saying, you can't take away our hat pins. We need these. And so it was just fascinating to me as this moment in history that nobody would ever really think about. I mean, we probably have similar situations today. We just have different tools like smartphones to capture people who might come after us, you know. But in her case, I thought, well, I want to tell this story, but I ran into a problem. I couldn't find any biographical information about Sadie Williams. I didn't know where she was born. I didn't know how old she was. I didn't know who her parents were. And I asked our brilliant New York Times research desk for help. They said, we can't really find anything either. I mean, we looked in Ancestry.com, but Sadie Williams was an extremely popular name at the time. It's hard to tell if this was her. And, now that we're looking at these news articles about her, she's referred to by two different names. There's one that says Sadie Williams and there's one that says Barbara Knack. And in one of the articles, she said she was embarrassed about talking to the media. So I said, maybe she made up the name. Why don't we look for Barbara Knack? Again, we ran into some problems. We really couldn't find a Barbara Knack in that time frame, in that location. And my researcher said, I'm starting to wonder if this was even a real person. Maybe the papers all made her up for this good story, or one paper made her up and the rest just copied the story. We don't know what news organizations did at the time and how much they cared about accuracy. And I said, oh no, I already pretty much wrote up the story. I did a ton of research about hat pins. I would really love to tell it because I think it's just a great moment in history. Maybe we can get a little creative. Like this one article says that the conductor's name is Warren Symington. Maybe we can find some more information on him. And they said, okay, yeah, I found a descendant of Warren Symington. Great. So I call I think it was the granddaughter, and she says, oh, wow, this is so interesting that you're calling me about this. My grandfather was a conductor in Chicago. They didn't call it a streetcar, it was something else. But the reason I know is my dad told me that he would go along with his dad on rides. But I don't know any story about him getting robbed or a woman named Sadie Williams or Barbara Knack. And I said, well, is your father still alive? Would he be able to speak about it? And she said, well, he died 6 months ago. So I just missed him. Not only that, but he had really kept a ton of records about his family history, and they were all washed away in a flood, very recently. So I thought, oh no, well, this might be a dead end. She said to me, if you come across any more information, will you call me? Like, oh man, okay, back to square one. And so then I said, well, this article says that a firefighter jumped on board named John Kelly. Can we find out more about him? And they said, no, man, there were so many John Kellys at that time in Chicago. Let's just forget about that angle. I said, all right. Well, this article says she was going to a funeral. And the funeral home was located at this intersection. Can we check that out? And they said, oh, we did. The entire block was razed in 1910. So there's no more funeral home. And so I basically continued on like this. I kept finding little details and kept trying to search. I did come across one article about a Barbara Knack who died in a fire around the time that it could have been her, but based on the age that they described in the article, but I don't know for sure. And the closest I ever got was I found a descendant of a Barbara Knack, and it was, I think, a grandniece. And so I called her, and she says, as a matter of fact, my husband just started trying to collect data about our family history, both mine and his. Let me put him on the phone. And so I talked to him. He says, well, I can dig around a little bit and get back to you. And that was it. I never heard anything again, even though I followed up. So I'm just going to guess that they didn't find anything. And so this story remains hidden in our system, one day waiting to see the light of day. And hopefully it will. Or maybe there's another major hat pin pioneer who's I can tell the story through their lens instead.
I know a lot of the fashion historians on here can definitely relate with not only the research and the pitfalls, but some of the people on the Zoom call are also historians of millinery, so I'm sure that they very much enjoyed that. But it is always frustrating when you keep on coming across, these dead ends, especially with floods in museums or lost documents. But I feel like even that whole research story could be, a whole article or a whole book or mini journal article. Well, since launching Overlooked, you've had such incredible spin-offs of various things from your TED Talk to celebrities reading these obituaries to now the Netflix series that's going to be launched. Can you talk a little bit about how these things came about and just your experience with them?
Yeah, I think that Overlooked launched at a real moment with Me Too bubbling up, and it just sort of resonated with a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. With Netflix, I know the producers said that they have been looking for a way to tell the stories of women, and they just didn't really know how. And then one day they pulled open the homepage of the New York Times and they saw Overlooked, and they said, "Oh my gosh, this is perfect." Looking back in history, it makes so much sense. And so I know they got the green light to formulate a writer's room, and that work is happening now, which is really exciting. I can't wait to see it come to life. With the other stuff, it was really just, I think people looked at the project and thought, well, what voices can we bring to light? There have been museum exhibits, as you mentioned, the TED Talk. I think this idea of representation and shining a light on people who may not have ever had that opportunity before has just really grown and taken off in so many different ways. So,
That's so wonderful. Before we open it up for questions, is there anything else you want to share with us? I mean, all these incredible stories, love to hear about them, but is there anything else you want to share about the series or anything else?
and I could talk about this work forever. I'm curious to hear what questions people might have. Um, but yeah, just Overlooked is continuing. I've had some really great figures for Pride Month. There was Alan Turing, Roberta Cowell, who was a NASCAR driver, or not NASCAR, but I think it was a different. I'm not good with auto racing. She was an auto racer who was known as the first woman to undergo sex reassignment surgery in England. These are big names. I mean, the fact that Alan Turing never got an obit says so much about our society and where we were at. I can't speak to why the editors of the New York Times never ran these stories at the time, but all I know is that this is the time to do it now. So,
Absolutely. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. I'm sure Amy would be happy to answer any of them. So while people are kind of starting to formulate their questions and ideas, Amy, we always kind of ask a question to everybody is for burgeoning either fashion journalists or just journalists in general, what advice would you have for them?
one thing I've found, particularly maybe because of my generation and my short attention span, whenever I'm beginning to work on a story, I always want to jump into writing and actually like crafting the sentences. But there's a lot to be said for research, and I know it can feel like it's going on forever and feels very arduous at times. But I have seen some of my colleagues on obituaries print out like 80 pages of biographies and articles, all kinds of stuff about the subject that they're researching. And they will go through it all, highlighting meticulously before they even begin to write one word. And so I think there's really something to be said about taking that time to do the research. And it's really just going to make your story so much better because of some of the nuances that come up. I mean, we say when I first joined the obituaries desk, I was very intimidated about the idea of trying to capture somebody's entire life in a few hundred words. And I was really marveling at how these obituary writers made it seem like they knew the person. Meanwhile, they often have never met them at all. And, that's one of the sort of curses of obituary writing is you'll never get to meet the person that you spent so much time learning about. And I asked this one obit writer, "What do you do?" And she said a lot of it is about good listening and good research and just sort of repeating back what you hear, almost like a therapist. And she said you'd be surprised how many people come and say like, "Oh, it's as though you knew this person their whole life." And she's like, "All I did was repeat what you told me." So I think so much of it is just like good research, good reporting.
Excellent. So we have a question. Do you see a time that overlooked becomes something that the Times no longer needs? Will there be a moment when people are no longer overlooked?
Thanks a lot for asking that. I really hope so, but for now, the sky appears to be the limit. I know that on Obituaries, I've been working really hard at trying to balance our representation. When I first started out on Obits, we had about 20 to 25% of our Obits about women, and I can't say that it's changed that much. We've got it up to about 32%, which is great. That's since the launch of Overlooked, but it's still only just a beginning. It's really disappointing when I looked back at our archives. The New York Times began publishing in 1851. So from 1851 to 2017, I was curious to know how many of our obits were on women. Did it ever surpass 20%? Even back in the day when our obits were different, there are more society pages, one paragraph here, one paragraph there. And what we found was that no, it never went above that. It was pretty much from 10 to 22% roughly. That was so disheartening. Good to know we were able to nudge that number a bit, but I would like to see it be a balanced 50-50 at the very least. And also, I'm curious to know about people of color in our obituaries and how they're represented. And that's something we're only just beginning to look into. So, yeah, I hope that there will be a time when Overlooked is no longer necessary, but it seems to me like it's going to take a while.
Absolutely. And Nadine has written in the chat, she is our millinery historian, and it looks like she has a source for you. And it's a book about the controversy, Beware the Mashers, Sexual Harassment in American Public Places from 1880 to 1930.
I reached out to this author several times and just really, I never got a call back. But I was just thinking about that yesterday, in preparation for this talk, that maybe I should try again. Maybe there are other ways I can find the author, but I've left voicemails and emails and reached out to the publisher and just have had zero luck. So I don't know why that is. But yeah, I mean, it's worth trying again.
Absolutely. And maybe if Nadine or somebody else has a contact there, we'll be sure to connect you to.
That would be awesome.
So we have another question on what is Amy's favorite resource for research?
Ooh, that's a good one. We always obviously start with Google, and we always look at LexisNexis too. I don't know if you all have access to it, but looking back at those articles can be really helpful. It only goes back so far. So there are a couple of things. I think the NYPL has a biographies database that's really useful. But for me, probably my top favorite is newspapers.com, just because it has a lot of local newspapers from all over the country. And I've run into these issues where we had an Overlooked for a woman who went by Pigfoot Mary, I believe. She sold pig's feet on a street corner in Harlem from a baby stroller. And this is around the time when a lot of African Americans were moving up north and trying to make a life for themselves. And she was really into food. And so that was what she brought to the table. But the writer, when she filed her first draft, it had only a few facts in it. And I thought, well, I would really like to know more about her life. And she said, well, I can't really find anything. Do you have any ideas? And I said, check newspapers.com for the era in which she lived. And sure enough, she found a wealth of information. The Afro-American also, the newspaper from Baltimore, also has been extremely helpful in my research. So I think, yeah, trying to find any sources from the day that the person lived, however large or small, local papers or big, that has been enormously helpful.
Excellent. And can you tell us a little bit about? I was lucky enough to go on one of the archive tours of the New York Times, and they have incredible archives. And they had this padlock on this file cabinet, and it said Obituaries. And we were asking about what is the process for the people who that have obituaries or will have obituaries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So that room is great I don't know if everybody knows, but in the building next door in the sub basement level, there's this room that we call the morgue. And it has like file cabinet after file cabinet of files that some previous journalists scrupulously kept. They would cut out these clips of newspaper articles, circle the name of the person in question, and put it in a file, stick it in a drawer. And to this day, when we're writing obits, we go down there and pull the clips and read about those people. There's also 6 million photographs in there that we recently began digitizing into Google Cloud. And we started telling stories from our past through this team called Past Tense. And so all kinds of great stuff has come out of that room. And so there is that file cabinet. I've seen it myself. I don't think the lock is actually locked, but but it is there. And it does have a few select people. I don't know how many people reference it to this day. Obviously now everything is on a computer somewhere, but we have advanced obits for about 2,000 people. People who have not yet died. And it's sort of, especially in this day and age when breaking news is everything, you have to stay on your toes, you have to be competitive, everything is immediate on the web. It's so key for us to have these advanced obits for really big name people. So it is a little bit creepy to some. I know that my colleagues have called people to interview them for their own obit while they're still alive, and they've hung up the phone, they've slammed the door in their face, like all kinds of reactions. But some people are really excited about it. There's the woman who invented the poodle skirt. I overheard, she hasn't died yet, but I think she's in her early 100s by now. But I remember hearing my colleague on the phone with her, and she would always start with this line: I work at the New York Times and I'm collecting some biographical data for my records. And she started asking this woman all these questions, and she is a particularly detailed reporter. And so she said, so what type of scissors did you use to cut the fabric? And the woman says, oh, you're writing my obituary, aren't you? I'm so delighted. And so some people find it to be a real honor. And I would hope more people see it that way. I mean, unless you're a villain like Charles Manson, maybe you don't want to be, or maybe he did want to because he appreciated getting attention. But for most people, I think they see it as an honor to have their legacy recorded in such a way. And so yeah, we collect these advanced obits, we write them, we have to frequently update them, which is tricky. We have all the heads of state for the U.S. We do have an advance for Trump, but that has to be updated very, very often. And yeah, so that's mostly the process.
Excellent. And April, who has the podcast Dressed, said Julie Lynn that they had an episode about her, and she has a little comment in here for you about that. So with, I mean, I think it's great, especially as historians, we always, in the museum field, always struggle with, do we have exhibition on living designers? The Met for a very long time said, we won't do exhibitions on living designers, and they've since broke that. But I think it is kind of difficult is, how close is too close when you're reporting on a history or something. But I think it's also challenging too, that if you wait too long, then you might not get the information that happened at that moment. So that's nice about the advanced obituaries, that you're still collecting while it's actually happening, but then still taking some of that time.
Yeah, we even, for a little while, we were doing this video series called Last Word, and we still do it from time to time. One example of a recent one that was poignant for me was Stan Lee, the creator of Marvel Comics. Well, arguably the creator of Marvel Comics. It was around, I think I mentioned I joined Obituaries in 2017. I joined the New York Times in 2011, and that was my first foray into digital, because since I was always been focused on print. And so I was trying to think of creative things I could do, and I noticed nobody was paying attention to obituaries and digital storytelling, and Stan Lee was on our advanced obit list. And I thought, how neat would it be if we could tell his story in the format of like a comic book, for instance. And so instead of a standard obituary, we did end up doing an appreciation of him that way. And we had Marvel artists draw out what he meant to them. He did a last word, and it ends with a question like, what do you want people to know about your legacy? Something to that effect. And he says, what do I care? I'm dead. It was just a really great answer. And I think it's really, really important that we talk to people while they're still alive and capture their legacies. I'm a big fan of like StoryCorps, for instance, with NPR. That sort of information down the line is so important. And I think it's key for us too to be recording our legacies somewhere, whether we're telling somebody we know or writing it down and just sticking it in a file somewhere. Somebody down the line is going to want to know how you did XYZ, how you used your hat pin to save yourself one day and others. It's just so, you'd be surprised like how many people don't think their voice is really that important or that they've done anything worth noting, but you don't know 100 years from now who's going to be looking for you. So
Wonderful. So I'll give a last minute or two if anybody else has any other questions. But Amy, what do you see for the future? Do you have any other bubbling ideas or things, or just going to continue with adding to Overlooked and the series and everything?
yeah, I'm trying to think of other things that we could be doing, other voices we could be including, whether it's through Overlooked or something else. I think a lot of us at the New York Times are thinking about Black Lives Matter and what other projects we could be telling out of our history, particularly when it comes to race. So I don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, but we have been looking at that. We've also been looking a little bit at true crime and a lot of the true crime dramas that have found their way onto television that are rooted in journalistic tales from the past. So I'm wondering if there's something to do there, but nothing quite formulated yet. So if anybody has ideas, you're welcome to reach out.
Wonderful. Well, Amy, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been really exciting and love hearing the hat pin stories always, along with all of the other ones. And thank you so much for your contribution to just history in general and making it more inclusive.
Thanks again, and good
Of
luck to
course.
everybody.
Thank you. Everybody, thank you so much for joining. And we will be posting this online. So we hope to see everybody again soon. And thank you for coming. And one last pitch. On Friday, we're going to be having our movie night, The Gospel According to Andre, where we will be watching it together at, I believe, around 7 o'clock. We will have a themed menu that Sarah is creating. And we will also then, starting about 8:30, we're going to be having a discussion about the Gospel According to Andre. So that and a lot of the things coming out of his book, we would love to hear you and your thoughts about it. But until then, thank you very much and have a wonderful day.